Betty Broderick, born Elizabeth M. Bisceglia, and Daniel T. Broderick III met in the early 1960s in South Bend, Indiana, when Betty was a student at a Catholic girls' school, and Dan was studying at the University of Notre Dame. They married in April 1969 and moved to the East Coast, where Dan attended Cornell Medical School. They later moved to Massachusetts, where he attended Harvard Law School. During these years, Betty worked multiple jobs to support the family as Dan pursued his education. The couple eventually settled in San Diego, California, where Dan became a prominent medical malpractice attorney. Over the years, they had 4 children, Kim, Lee, Daniel, and Rhett. By the 1980s, the Brodericks were living a comfortable life in the affluent La Jolla community. In 1983, Betty began to suspect that Dan was having an affair with his 21-year-old legal assistant, Linda Kolkina. Although Dan denied it initially, the signs were there. He worked long hours, became increasingly distant, and their relationship grew strained. After a year of suspicions, Betty confronted him. By 1985, Dan filed for divorce, which turned into a lengthy and contentious process. Betty felt betrayed and claimed that Dan had manipulated her financially and emotionally throughout their marriage. The divorce proceedings, which lasted until 1989, became incredibly bitter. Betty accused Dan of using his legal knowledge to gain an advantage in court. Dan, who had connections in the legal community, was eventually granted full custody of the children, further fueling Betty's resentment. The court battles, financial strain, and custody loss deeply affected her, and her mental health began to decline. During this time, she reportedly vandalized Dan's property and left hostile messages on his answering machine. In 1989, Dan married Linda Kolkina. The newlyweds moved into a beautiful home in Marston Hills, San Diego. Despite the divorce and his new marriage, Betty remained fixated on Dan and Linda, believing they had wronged her. She repeatedly violated court orders, resulting in fines and temporary jail time. On several occasions, Betty displayed erratic behavior. She would often drive to Dan's home, hurl objects at his windows, and leave profane messages. Although Dan and Linda tried to secure a restraining order, Betty continued to harass them, and the tension between them only escalated. In the early hours of November 5, 1989, Betty entered Dan and Linda's home using a key she had stolen from her daughter. She made her way to the bedroom, where Dan and Linda were sleeping. Shortly after entering the room, Betty fired 5 shots from a .38 caliber revolver, fatally wounding both Dan and Linda. Betty claimed that her intentions were not to harm them but to confront them about the emotional pain she had endured. According to her, the situation escalated in a way she had not anticipated. Betty left the scene and later turned herself in to the police, confessing to the shooting. Betty was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. Her defense argued that she had been emotionally abused for years and that her actions were the result of battered wife syndrome. They claimed that the lengthy divorce and the perceived injustices in court had pushed her to a breaking point. The first trial, which took place in 1990, ended in a mistrial after the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. However, a second trial in 1991 resulted in Betty's conviction on 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole. Throughout the trial, Betty maintained that she had been pushed to her breaking point and that her actions were not premeditated. The case became a media sensation, with people divided over whether Betty was a victim of a manipulative husband or a vengeful ex-wife unwilling to move on. The Betty Broderick case has since been the subject of many books, documentaries, and television adaptations. In the court of public opinion, people remain divided. Some empathize with Betty's struggle and believe she was a victim of emotional abuse, while others view her actions as inexcusable. The case became a cultural touchpoint, highlighting the potential impact of divorce, financial control, and mental health issues on a person's life. Betty has been denied parole multiple times, with her next hearing scheduled for 2032. Today, she remains in custody, and her story continues to spark discussions about the complexities of relationships, mental health, and the consequences of unchecked anger. Betty has been denied parole multiple times, with her next hearing scheduled for 2032. Today, she remains in custody, and her story continues to spark discussions about the complexities of relationships, mental health, and the consequences of unchecked anger. The Betty Broderick case remains one of the most high-profile stories of betrayal, heartbreak, and tragedy. It underscores the importance of seeking help when dealing with emotional turmoil and the need for compassion and understanding when relationships fall apart. Betty's story serves as a reminder of how unresolved pain and resentment can have devastating consequences if not addressed.